Welcome, everybody. This is a session on why diversity matters. Thanks for coming. Let's start with some introductions. My name is Jeff Lynn. I'm the founder of Bust Out. We are a custom web and mobile app development shop in our 15th year of business, which is geriatric for the tech world. I would like to let everyone on the panel introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what you do and why you're on the panel. Let's start down on that end.
Hello. Is this working? Oh, hello. All right, sweet. Cool. So I'm Antoinette Smith. I am the co-founder of Techquity, which is a local organization focused on, oh man, sorry, I just blanked out. I know. It's a local organization focused on basically creating an inclusive tech economy, focused primarily on African Americans in tech, but also focused on people of color as a whole in tech. So we do quite a few events. You can visit us at techquity.mn. In addition to that, I work for a place called Glitch, not the Glitch here, which is a gaming thing, but glitch.com, where you can build the app of your dreams. And I'm an engineer there. Oh, and why am I here? Okay, so I am here because I've been previously pretty loud about my experiences in the tech industry locally. And I think it's really important just for the world and the world I want to live in to have discussions like this.
Hello, my name is Janessa White. I am a front-end developer at Software for Good here. I've been doing that for about 2 years now, and I used to be, I should say, super involved in a lot of different organizations, on the board of different organizations, and on leadership teams. And I'm here probably because Jeff asked, otherwise I would have done it. Because, but also just because I've had a lot of different experiences, both good and bad, in this space. And I think it's important to talk about what that looks like from my perspective, but also give ideas on how we can improve this situation.
My name's Elliot Payne. I'm the founder of SenseDatum LLC. That's a digital business consultancy, I call it a digital business consultancy because there's so many things that you can be doing in this space. Human-centered design, user experience design, product management, kind of the intersection of business, creative, and technology. And I am here because I used to work in kind of the creative agency universe, and I think around the time that Ferguson happened, I looked up from my desk and I looked around at all the faces and realized I was the only person of color. And the world was on fire for me and for everybody else. They were just kind of going about drinking their free beer and having a good time. And I recognized that there was something that needed to change. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Philip Shao. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Homey, and we're a marketplace for students, alumni, and companies. So what we do is we connect companies with underrepresented, undiscovered talent from schools that they would never normally recruit from. And we do that via alumni. I got involved in the diversity and inclusion space about a year ago, mostly because we were having these conversations with HR departments at Fortune 500 companies and startups, and they were talking about diversity and inclusion, and it was a lot of talk about it, but. And so when this is actually my very first D&I panel, I've always been on the outskirts, just watching, learning. But when Jeff asked me to share my story here, it was a really exciting opportunity.
I got a mic.
Okay.
I'm special. So here's an interesting fact, and Paul Cantrell, I might actually just chime in 1 second here about the session. So a lot of people indicated interest in this session, and Paul built, or is part of the team that managed the software that places people in rooms based on the votes. And you want to talk a little bit about the history of diversity sessions.
We always pay really careful attention as much as we can to the relationship between votes cast and actual attendance, because we're trying to size sessions well for groups. And I've noticed over the years that if the session has the word diversity in the title, it tends to attract a lot of votes and is consistently one of the most underattended relative to the votes cast, which is kind of a metaphor for everything.
Yeah. So this was Maria. This was the top vote getter session, and you can see that there's not 100 and some many people that signed up.
Peterson's session had to do a handful of votes, but it was top.
Sure. This is a hard topic. So what you're going to hear today might make you feel uncomfortable. Hopefully it does, because it's not a comfortable subject. A couple ground rules here. Like, we're going to take some comments and questions from the audience. Would love to. You can ask things that make other people feel uncomfortable. We may say things that make you feel uncomfortable. That is completely okay. It is not okay to be disrespectful. If anybody is disrespectful or violates the code of conduct, we will toss you out in a respectful way. Yeah. Just a kind of a brief intro to like kind of what we're talking about here. So we're gonna dive into like what is diversity, but just kind of a personal note. Like, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio. By chance, is there anybody from Oberlin here, or went to Oberlin? Okay, Oberlin's a weird town. It's a college town. It's a very diverse and international town because of the college. And so I really kind of discovered what the world was like when I left Oberlin, and realized that it was not this like diverse, like racially, culturally, religiously, economically diverse place. And I came to Minnesota and went to Carleton College, which is kind of known as being a very liberal school. I went there and I went, oh my God, this place is so conservative. And my classmates said, you are going to fail in the world, because I was not prepared for a world that we live in. I have a question that may seem unrelated. By show of hands, how many of you are musicians or play music instrument? Okay, how many of you speak a second language other than your mother tongue? All right, so when you play music, how many of you learned your music or your language, let's say, before the age of 7? Okay. So when you do something like that, it becomes natural, right? If you're playing music, do you have to think about it? Or if you're speaking your second language, do you have to think about it? It just flows, right? To me, like, understanding diversity is the same as the language or the instrument. If you've done it since you were born, you kind of get it. You kind of have a feeling for it. If you come to it at a later point in life and you kind of go, oh, I really need to learn this. It is absolutely possible to learn and understand. Just like I learned German when I was in my 20s. It's not a natural language. I grew up speaking Taiwanese and English as a child. When I was in my 20s, I learned German academically. I'm not great at it. I have to think about it. Diversity is the same thing. I feel like the same mindset is in place here, where if you come to it at a later point in life, you can learn it, but you have to work hard at it. If you are a musician, you played the piano your whole life, and as an adult, you go, you know what, I'm going to learn the drums. You may be pretty good because you already know some music, but it's going to be really hard to get good at the drums as a 30, 40-year-old. And so what I'm going to encourage you is, like, don't think that this is easy. If you want to actually be informed, be an ally, be an advocate, like, be prepared to really work hard at it. So I want to start with understanding why. The whole point of this talk is, like, why diversity matters. So I'll ask the panel. Why does it matter if a workplace or a community or a neighborhood is diverse?
I'll kick us off. I think that the world is changing, and the way that we do things and the demographics that we have as companies is changing. And in order to adapt to those demographics, you have to understand your market, and that market is becoming increasingly diverse. whether that's with race, age, orientation. And it's something where that's a business case for it, and that's why diversity and inclusion has really come into the spotlight in the last 5 or 10 years. But I think that the real question is, how do you hire diverse talent, but also create an inclusive culture where that talent doesn't just leave after 18 months? And I think that's the question that we're all trying to solve here. And it's a lot of little steps, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
I mean, there's the general decency of treating everybody humanely. That's, reason enough, right? But maybe not so common sense. I think a more practical reason is, and I'm kind of in that late middle 30s, so I'm old enough to have experienced some things in life, and I'm young enough to have some more time to experience more things, I hope. And one of the most important things that I've realized in my kind of medium time on Earth is the value of understanding what is general and what's specific. So, after you've seen something happen a number of times, you can start seeing the pattern. And as an individual, you have enough time to see things happen over and over again. But you can condense that time if you have more perspectives that you steep yourself in. And that's kind of what diversity is to me, is getting increasing opportunities to see what's general versus what's specific. What lessons can I apply from one domain and apply to another? I was just reading an article on synthetic biology, and the overlap between synthetic biology and our understanding of the genome in computer science is really fascinating. And the only way that you find that overlap and then start advancing synthetic biology is having a biologist and a computer scientist kind of sit together and start sharing some of those concepts back and forth. And that's just one dimension of diversity, and there's infinite dimensions to diversity. And so I kind of feel like there's this kind of need for us as humanity to start making those connections. That's where a lot of the business value comes from in diversity, from my opinion.
All right, science. I should have went before you. So for me, this is very simple in my head, and it's what you said first. People are people. You should treat people the way you expect and would like to be treated. And to have a place where either you're in charge or you work as a developer under a bunch of other people, not be inclusive and not be a safe work environment or even a product that somebody can anybody can use, it's not going to work in the long run. We're not in that space anymore, and the world is getting more diverse by the second, and if you are behind in this, you're going to stay behind. You're not going to be able to catch up. So it's just that simple. You want to go?
Thank you for this opportunity. Man, so this question is really hard for me, right? So when I was younger, so probably 7 years ago, this was very easy, right? I know, 7 whole years ago, I felt that I grew up and I feel like I had a pretty good life. I felt I've been doing the things I want to do. And when things happen, when Trayvon Martin happens, when Ferguson happens, I look around and I'm like, why can't everyone have a good life? Why can't everyone be able to do the things that they want to do? And it makes me really sad, really from an emotional level, it's unfair to me. And I'm I don't really understand how we could live in a world that is like this. And I feel in companies where I've worked at, we talk about the business case for diversity. And if you are trying to market things to a increasingly diverse world, then you want to have a diverse team. So you're building the right thing. But frankly, from just a humanities standpoint, it feels like bullshit, right? It's just no, people inherently from the day we are born, we should be able to live lives in which we are not, stressed, where we're not constantly under pressure, where we're not depressed, where we're getting the things that we need. And sorry, I told someone, I was I'm all over the place today. But it's important. It's important to me. It's important, I think, for the world. I feel we're at a space in time where we can make a decision. We can make a decision that we want our workplaces, because those are the places where we spend the most time, to drive, especially because, we are in a capitalist economy, we can make our workplaces the place where diversity actually happens. And then when people see that there's money to it, then maybe society will start to be like, oh, snap, this is actually working out and people are getting paid. And so maybe we can do the things that we haven't been doing and making this world a little more equitable.
Can I say something on top of that? I think it's really, really important to this conversation, even though this panel is, very, ethnically diverse. This impacts everyone. This whole concept of too much stress, too much pressure, too much hurriedness, not enough reflection, that affects everyone. And so everybody feels under the gun and under pressure in their professional lives. And when we create more inclusive cultures, and when everybody can show up as themselves, that benefits everybody. That benefits the white, cisgendered, football-loving, red-blooded American, right? Everybody benefits when you feel like you are not putting a mask on. And I think it's just really important to that point around, this isn't just like making it better for, black people or disadvantaged people or marginalized people. It's like everyone's lives are going to be better when we resolve this kind of tension.
That's a very good point. I do a lot of work in the music and arts in the local Twin Cities. And one of the initiatives with the organizations that I work with is to diversify their audience. And originally they were thinking that it meant to, like, let's market in North Minneapolis. Let's go play concerts in the Rondo neighborhood. And when I came on board, this is with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the Ordway, and the Schubert Club, I said, look at your audience. They're 65 years old and up. And granted, mostly white, but they're 65 years old and up. Your diversity problem is age. And so if you tackle the age diversity problem, which happens in tech too, it happens in any workplace. Age diversity is equally as important as all other types of diversity. So that didn't intend to transition right into this, but that's a good segue. What is diversity? So to your point, this is a very non-white panel right here, but what are we talking about?
I can jump in and just say, diversity is simply numbers. So you can effectively address diversity in the workplace by hiring a bunch of janitors or other administrative staff. And you see a lot of this happen. You'll go to some agency that has really great, leadership and diversity, and they have their front desk person as a person of color. And that's good, but that's what diversity is, and we shouldn't think that is we're good and done once we hit some arbitrary number. That's my opinion on diversity alone.
I think a big part of diversity comes from understanding. And I wore this hoodie today. I was checking with Jeff about it. This is a really special hoodie. It's my lucky hoodie. Now, these holes are supposed to be here. And
This is age diversity in fashion here.
So I was actually at Best Buy a couple months ago, and I'm from California originally, and we grow tangerines in our backyard. So I was dropping off a box of tangerines for the HR department here, because we're talking to them about campus recruiting and whatnot. So I'm in here, I'm wearing this hoodie, and I'm wearing a pair of sweats, and I'm just walking, I just came to drop off tangerines, and I'm walking past the conference room, and I smell hot pot. Like, do you guys know what hot pot is? Yeah, right. And so I walk into this room, and they're setting up this hot pot dinner, and it's this nonprofit called Marnita's Table. Okay, no Marnita, all right. And they're having a diversity dinner for all the senior management, like the C-suite execs and whatnot. So I just walk in, following my nose, and Marnita comes up to me, and she's like, "You want to stay for dinner?" I was like, I don't work here. and she's like, "Oh, it's okay." And so next thing I know, I'm at hot pot dinner with all these Best Buy execs, and I'm making them hot pot and explaining the relevance of hot pot in Chinese culture and how I ate it when I grew up. And Hubert Joly walks in, gives this big talk, and sits at the table next to me, and I'm wearing this. And and that was this. It was this moment where you saw all these different people at the table, and they were all from different backgrounds and cultures, but they were all coming together through food. And it was this really cool medium to bring people together. And so that's what really sparked my interest in this diversity conversation. So, oh, and then the funny story is that like 2 days later, I had gone to Jeff's house for hot pot because it was like Chinese New Year time, and I had worn this exact same hoodie. And he outed me in the comments on LinkedIn. He was like, "Yo, like you wore that hoodie yesterday."
Yeah, it's a hoodie. You can wear it more than once in a week.
Yeah, every day.
Every day.
I think the answer that Elliot gave is pretty good. Diversity is definitely like a numbers thing, and I think once we get to the next point, we can talk about why that's not enough.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and go with that. Numbers. Efficiency, y'all.
Right. So you can set a metric, right? A company can set a metric. We want to be 50% women. Does that work? Why not?
So there's a really good aphorism on this, the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is getting the invitation to the party, and inclusion is getting invited to dance. So it's kind of a simple aphorism, I guess why they call it that, but it kind of gets the point across of, again, you can have people in the room, and I do workshops on diversity and inclusion in the advertising space, and so we have a workshop on implicit bias in the creative process, and one of the examples that we use is the Pepsi commercial with Kylie Jenner solving racism with a can of Pepsi. Kendall, I don't care about these people, just for the record.
For those of you who don't know the commercial, just give a brief explanation.
Basically, it is, you can see the brief, the creative brief in the commercial around how like diverse the millennials are, the zillennials are, and how, much millennials value brands that have some sort of social consciousness. And so you can see all this attempt at social consciousness with this like activism scenery party situation. And then they come up to a line of police that really looked like mall cops based on the costuming, and it was really bad. But Kylie Kendall Jenner or Kendall?
Kendall Jenner.
Kendall? One of the Jenner kids? Opens up a can of Pepsi and hands it to the police that's like sitting there like he's ready to beat them. And then he like turns into a smile, and then Pepsi's like the center of the universe of solving this crisis of black crime or black brutality from the police. And so it's just a very tone deaf thing. I guarantee there were black people on the creative team, there were black executives, possibly. There were black people involved with the shooting of this commercial. But there was no black person involved that had a voice that could speak up on these decisions that were clearly in poor taste, because literally people are dying in the streets at the hands of the police, and it's not cute, and it's not fun, and it's not Pepsi generation. It's a really serious thing, and it should be dealt with seriously, not in a way to sell sugar water. And so that, again, you can have a diversity of your team, but if they're all kind of like junior copywriters or junior graphic designers or something like that, they're not a creative director who has the control to say this is a good idea and that's a bad idea. That's the difference between diversity and inclusion.
To piggyback off of that, so especially with this like junior versus like senior versus like who's in charge, you can have a junior in the room, and that person should be able and should be encouraged to contribute, and the people that are their leaders should be willing and excited to hear those ideas, because why else are they there? If you can't foster an environment that encourages them to speak their mind and sees a flaw like that and says, excuse me, Kendall is great and all, but her giving this small cop, Paul Blart here, Pepsi is not going to stop police brutality. Like, that should have been able to been said, and then we can have a discussion on that. If we can't have a discussion on that, that's not an inclusive environment. And if you can't see that, but you're like, oh, we're diverse. Like, yeah, you hit your mark, but you're not inclusive. And if you're not inclusive, like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, and I love the point about not just hitting the numbers, because it's one thing to just hire this quota of people. It's another thing to go and have a conversation with the top 50 or 100 people in your senior management and ask them how they're leaning in and how they're making the company culture more diverse. I was at a workshop, like a 3-day inclusion workshop. It was the Forum on Workplace Inclusion at St. Thomas this last week. And they brought in Dia Khan. She filmed the documentary behind the white supremacist movement, the stuff that happened in Charlottesville. And she brought on someone who had lost his father to white supremacy and a former white supremacist. And these two guys had reconnected years afterwards, and they had written a book together, and they were touring and talking about their story. And they said something really, really impactful. And it was cultural diversity and inclusion isn't about making your Muslim employees feel welcome at corporate happy hour. It's about going to your Muslim homie's house during Ramadan and having biryani with them, right? Because that's real understanding. And the only way you're going to build an inclusive culture is by actually understanding.
I think that gets at the earlier point is that this is not easy. It often involves stepping out of your comfort zone. And as people in tech, we often do step out of comfort zone professionally, especially if we're trying to be innovators. You have to do things that are uncertain or unsure, and that should be done in your everyday life too. So when you're in a situation that doesn't feel inclusive, or let's start with it's not diverse, and if it's not diverse and if it doesn't feel inclusive, what do you do?
Okay, when you say what do you mean like us as an individual or like?
Either you as an individual, or what should one do? What should a company do, or what should an individual do if the situation is not inclusive or diverse?
Well, okay, so the organization that I do these workshops through is called the Brand Lab, and they get kind of like seniors in high schools, juniors, sophomores in college, internships into the advertising industry. And they come from very diverse backgrounds, both demographically and socioeconomically. And after 10 years of this organization putting all of these young professionals into some of these early career opportunities, we started to see that, 10 years on, we've got a bunch of kids who are now young adults that are working professionally, and they either never got into the industry post having like the most impressive resumes I've ever seen, or they went into it and then kind of left after 6 months to a year. And the reason is because the culture, you can't just throw somebody into some of these kind of really fratty cultures in a lot of cases and have them succeed. And your comment about Ramadan, like what feels welcoming, what feels comfortable. Sometimes it's the food you eat, it's the rituals, it's the cultural norms, and cultural fit is one of those things that gets thrown around the hiring process, but you have to shift it into cultural add. And oftentimes diversity does fail as an initiative because if you don't address your culture, it doesn't matter how many bodies you throw into this space. Those initiatives won't work if people don't feel welcome, if your culture hasn't been shifted accordingly to welcome people and let them feel like they can be themselves.
So I think like one of the things that is really important is that the head of that company has to actually be behind these initiatives, and they have to talk about that, and they have to make sure that everyone knows that that's the case, because otherwise there's no point for anyone to change. Like if the CEO doesn't care, then no one else has to care. So that's number one. One of the things I will say about like the place I work now is based out of New York, and the CEO is a guy that I've followed on Twitter. And so like he's very loud on Twitter. He talks about a lot of things that I value. He's like friends with a lot of like Twitter personalities I admire that are black women. So I was like, I want to work at this company. Like this is going to be a company like none I've ever worked for. And I would say that when I first got to that company, because it was originally a different company, that was a really cool company, but also a very non-diverse company. I got to the company and I was like, you're based out of New York, but you don't look like New York, right? You still have mostly white cis males here. But like we're a startup and we just got a bunch of money last year. So they've been hiring a lot. And what I've seen is like there are so many women of color, like in all these new roles, and I feel so happy. Like literally the first time, like a few months ago, a black woman got hired, I was like, oh snap, I'm not the only black woman in this company. Like, when is the last time that's happened to me? But I mean, like, it's things like that. Like, if you are really serious, if your company is really serious about changing your culture, the CEO has to be like, this is important, and then you have to actually put the work in. Like, it's not going to be easy, but you know what? It becomes easier like everything else with practice.
Yes. Oh, wow. Isn't it amazing that you had to go to New York to get that? So I'll say this from an outside of like, so like just in like an organization standpoint, like I'm sure a ton of us in here go to like a bunch of different meetups and they control our evenings and it's terrible. But if you can imagine like, so you are at a meetup and you see something go wrong and there's a code of conduct, right? Allegedly. It's written out somewhere on meetup.com. And you go to whoever's in charge of that meetup and nothing happens. That's a problem, right? And so you go, and then if you're me, you go on the internet and you start talking about it. And then people start to listen because people don't like their business in the street. They just don't. I can tell you the amount of times that you could tweet at a company and get things fixed versus calling their customer service line and get nothing resolved. Like this is the same vein of like your CEO has to care. That organization leadership team has to care. And if they don't care, nothing about anything that happens underneath them is going to matter. Because they will just try to sweep it under the rug and like make it disappear. And it could be one of the most frustrating things because you want this thing to succeed. And even if you're on the leadership team like of like a local chapter, you want this thing to succeed and you're trying your hardest. But if nobody above you cares and you don't get the support that you need, you're gonna fail. And it's like the worst feeling in the world to not be able to support people or support yourself or not be supported. So I think that's like one of the reasons that this matters a lot is because they're from the work, just like the business aspect to like a person trying to get into this world, try to get into any field, advertising, being a developer, being in like whatever space. If you don't provide the support that they need, like there's just no way for them to, they don't want to stay. You want to leave, so.
I kind of want to add something, just a personal story. You talked about fratty cultures. So before going into tech, I really wanted to go to finance. And I only wanted to go into finance because I didn't know what else to do. When you're an immigrant or a child of immigrants, the conversation is usually get into a good college, and then no one actually tells you what to do after that. And so I was lucky enough to get into Carleton College in Northfield, and I was recruited to play tennis there. I ended up in Minnesota. I grew up in a primarily Asian part of California, so I didn't actually have white friends before I moved here. And I'd never seen snow. It was just this whole culture shock. And by the end of my senior year in college, I was living with these 5 large bearded football and rugby players. And I had learned all the American things, right, like chugging beer and like watching football. And when I was applying for jobs, it was, what do I do? And investment banking was like the thing to do at the time. And so I started applying for these jobs, and you very quickly realize that Wall Street doesn't go and recruit in Northfield, Minnesota. And so in order to break into that culture, you have to know someone. And when you start to think about that, that's a huge barrier, right? If your uncle doesn't work at Goldman Sachs, how are you supposed to get into Goldman? And so my path was reaching out to alumni, right? People who'd gone into finance, who'd gone through the industry. And by kind of talking to these people and learning from them, you weren't just learning what does an investment banker do. You were learning about what are the cultural nuances that go into the role? How do you carry yourself? How do you present your ideas in clear and polished ways? And how do you fit the culture? Which leads us to a bigger question of who builds that culture, right? Who really built Goldman's culture? It was a bunch of Harvard graduates who were white and their dads were bankers. And they hired people who fit the culture, which, were other people who graduated from Ivy League schools. And that going to Princeton to them was diversifying, right? And so it's always been kind of this crazy, like how when I think about culture fit and how to build an inclusive company. There's a lot of questions. And frankly, I'm learning too.
So we've got a little bit of time left. I want to give the audience, anybody in the audience, the opportunity to ask any questions or comments.
Don't be scared.
I'll throw it out. Especially being in the Midwest, I know a lot of people here work remotely. What about the challenges of promoting diversity and inclusion while being on a distributed team?
Yeah. Okay. So, like I said, my CEO is all about having a diverse company, and also our platform is all about getting more people creating the web instead of like people that look the same always creating all the web applications. Let's make this so that people can just hop on and make things. And so, a lot of our marketing is inclusive of like. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about like who do we want to have use our platform. We spend a lot of time highlighting creators of color and doing those sorts of things. And remotely, like as a remote company, and this isn't a remote working session, but we're a remote first company. So there's never any of those like meetings where like 10 people are in like a room with a camera and then you by yourself or at home like on your little camera and everyone's talking to each other and you're like, I don't know what's going on. Everyone is on their own little camera. So everyone is having the exact same experience. And I think that helps, especially with a remote culture. But the other thing that we do is recently we actually had an ally skills training. And so I found that was really good. It's actually like everyone should do it. There's a place, and I need to find the link. I'll put it on my Twitter at some point. But it's just like making sure that like you can have those sorts of things. Ally skills training, always talking about how diversity is important to your company. Like we have meetings every single week all together on video where, it's reinforced the things that we care about and value as a company.
I was going to add, working remotely is really about setting expectations and having norms around how you're supposed to work together. And it's like that much more important when you are remote. And I think that a lot of what happens, especially in the Midwest, is the cultural norms. But most people in Minnesota are from Minnesota a lot of the times, and they've been friends with their friends since elementary school. So the cultural norms are unwritten and unsaid, and everybody just agrees to them because everybody's, copacetic, right? But I think it's really important to have those norms documented and agreed to as a collective when you're working remotely. And I think you're going to have more effective teams when everybody's working off the same expectations. But then when you are explicitly saying, like we have a code of conduct for this conference, if people are off the mark on what our expectations are supposed to be, now we can have a conversation around that. And we're not having a conversation after the fact that something happened and, well, we never had this agreement, but you clearly crossed a line that we never drew. Those lines need to be clearer, just in general for remote work. Lines just need to be clearer. But when you talk about diverse cultures, it's like, what work is the organization doing to document your culture?
Yep.
So going back to the comment, it's just numbers. How do companies get past the numbers, see the people as individuals and what they can bring to the organization to add value?
I mean, I think there are, again, in documenting what you expect out of your culture, it's documenting what you expect out of any diversity initiative. So one great example is just we have a huge workforce gap right now. There's a ton of job openings, and that means that we need to start thinking more creatively around who's qualified for certain jobs. And so being able to articulate what your goals are, not from a numbers perspective, but from a values perspective, would go a long way, I think.
I also love your CEO and feel like he's one of my favorite people on Twitter. A while back, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the effect of
how he only retweets women and primarily looks to retweet black women. And that kind of goes in line with, like, if you think about who you're following on Twitter, who's following you, and go through and think about, like, am I following people who are all 100% like each other, or do I have a lot of diverse voices influencing me? So I think that thinking about it beyond the organization that we work in, but like just on the internet, I love how you talked about that attracted you to your company and to him as a personality and somebody who would run a company, and how that sets the culture. So I think that's something that's really influenced me. I will be honest, now whenever I think about retweeting a man, especially a white man, I refrain from that because I want to change the voice on the internet. And I can still agree with that person or like what they said, but like amplifying other people's voices has become more important just by hearing how he approached his Twitter. And he even wrote an article about how he deleted every single person he followed and started over. And so just thinking about that beyond the organization and how influence works on Twitter or LinkedIn, or how we amplify different people's voices.
Along those lines, I did my own little experiment once. I use LinkedIn a lot. I'm a business owner, so LinkedIn is a very useful tool to me. It is, honestly. But for about a year, I'm still kind of doing this right now. For about a year, I would only request LinkedIn connections with women and people of color. And I would accept requests from anybody, really, except for the spammers. But I would request from anybody, but I was kind of testing the algorithm just to see what would happen. Like, if I only requested connections to women and people of color, what would happen? And one day I opened my LinkedIn, and it looked like the United Nations, like with the recommended, you should follow. And it was amazing because prior to that, it was a lot of white men in Minnesota in tech, which is great. I do business with them all the time. But just to see even the algorithm change and go, we think you are interested in these people. And then I started taking the recommendations. And pretty soon, my LinkedIn community was incredibly diverse, and I actually met people that I hadn't met before.
I love what you said, Philip, about the meal, the hot meal. And I think that's a really great example of being asked to dance. And I think what I've struggled with is I've heard, well, don't expect people of color or trans people or Native people to teach you. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on other ways to ask the people to dance without it placing the burden on them.
That's a great question. And what I will say is that you will never understand what it's like to walk through this country as a person of color. And that's fine, right? But for me to help you understand that and for me to share my culture with you is my responsibility. So when we first moved to this town 4 years ago, we knew no one. There was no dad at Cargill who was going to introduce you to his business connects. And so we just moved up here and started emailing alumni. That's what we do. And one of the guys we hit up was Jeff. And I remember, I think Jeff Pesic from Tech.mn put us in touch. And we're talking, and I was like, hey, can I cook you a super dank Chinese meal? And he's like, yeah, that sounds great. Where do you live? And so I was like, we don't have an office, but we've rented out this house on 34th and Fremont where we live and work together, and we'd love to have you over for dinner. And he's like, oh, it's funny, I'm on 36th and Emerson. So he just walks over for dinner, and he comes in, and we cook him this really, really good meal. I think it was pork belly or something. And he's like, so where are we going to eat this? I was like, oh, we don't have a table yet, but we usually just kind of eat on the couch. And a week later, the dude shows up with a table.
And a futon.
And a futon.
And a futon.
I need a new table.
Right, you got it.
And the reason I bring all of that up is because I think it's, for at least for me, I'm really good at two things. One of them is cooking Chinese food, and the other one is playing tennis. And that's really all I'm good at. And those are the things that have really helped us build this company and this community. Every single dollar we've raised from investors in this town has not been from a traditional tech investor. Of the $714,000 in our angel round, every penny of that came from someone who I met either playing tennis with or sharing my culture in our company and getting to know the team. So I'll cook you some Chinese food sometime.
Dope. So what I'll say, to piggyback off what Phil said, like, I feel a small level of responsibility in educating people, and I'll tell you why it's small. One, because the internet is accessible to almost everybody in this room, and most of us learned some level of how to research things and how to look things up. And the only time I've shut down from educating people is when they come at me in a disrespectful, reckless way where they didn't even attempt to listen to what I've said beforehand. I'll be more than willing to answer like anybody's question about anything as long as you come correct. And I think that is just like a humane way of approaching something. If I have a question about Phil's culture, I might look something up quick and be like, hey, I looked this up. Is this correct? Or can you tell me about this thing? And I would expect him to be like, yeah, of course, like, let me teach you about that. I don't expect to come in at him, I'm not gonna say anything reckless, to be like, y'all do this, why do y'all do this, why do y'all do this? And then him to be like, oh, well, let me teach you. No, because I didn't come at him with respect. So if you don't approach with respect, how can you expect that back from somebody that is in a marginalized community that already has to deal with us on a daily basis? Why would they want to go that extra step to educate you?
So we realize that this session could probably go another 5 hours, but we're going to keep it on schedule. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the panelists.